I'm the president, so I get to, you know, as it were, say live from New York and Saturday night. So, if we could just get Mark up here.
Hey, he's getting a drink, and we're getting some water for the guests.
Oh, excellent, Chris. That was a good idea. You know, a smart president would have had that done already. You know, I just have to remind everybody, you know, this is a volunteer organization, and occasionally that shows through. You got a big crowd. A big crowd. Thank you. Frankly, they're here to see you. Yeah. As much as I'd like to believe that all of these people have come to hear me speak, they not so much. Yeah. You pipe down, you rowdy people in the back corner there.
I think Mark has this.
Oh,
they're waiting for it to settle.
Ah, that could be true.
It takes a while. That was good. Looks like a good story.
There you go. What you want to shoot for? We got to talk one time.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Fisher.
As is our tradition here at the Worcester Tea Party, we could all be upstanding because we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. We have a guest, a noted celebrity, Bobby, president of the North Central Tea Party. Will you please lead us in the pledge?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
One and not one.
Thank you. Tonight's moderator will be the famous John Weston of the Right Overnight Radio. Famous? I thought most people didn't stay up that late or get up that early. I'm gonna have to do this.
That's okay.
Anyway, good evening, everybody. How are you? Good night. Thank you very much for coming because obviously it's just a couple days before Christmas and it's in the middle of Hanukkah and there's probably half a dozen other things that you can celebrate this time of the year, so it's nice that you're here. Both of these gentlemen, I know had them both on my show. I think they're both great guys and I think that they both have an awful lot to contribute to this state. So it's really, I think, a great opportunity for us to listen to what they have to say, and it will, I think it'll be a good night, and thank you all for coming. Duct tape. Okay, that's still here.
No, shut it off.
Turn it on.
Oh, there it is. Okay. First of all, we have Mark Fisher. Mark, would you please stand? In case anybody doesn't know who you are, I don't know how that's not possible. Evan Falchuk. Evan, please stand. Again, stand here. First of all, I want to compliment the both of you when you were running for office, that you both paid attention to Central Massachusetts and you realized that once you get beyond 495, you don't have to stay overnight. You get a hotel room, and you know maybe that the Connecticut River really isn't the Pacific Ocean. So anyway, those seafood recipes kill me. For the next president, you know who I'm talking about, don't you? At least I hope you do. You better fight that. Anyway, let's get on to the questions. We're going to try to keep the 3-minute answers. It's just not, just to box it in, and we're not really under any time constraints, obviously. But Who wants to go first? Mark will go first. Okay, pull your mic up.
I'll go first.
There you go. All right. First question. If you had the campaign to do over again, what changes would you make? Would you concentrate more on one issue than another? And if you would, what are those issues?
On the issues, I'd say no, absolutely not. I think that both Evan and I believe that candidates should be candid, and you should let the voters know where you stand on all the issues so they can make informed choices. So on the issues, I'd say absolutely not. But I think that both of us were candid throughout the campaign. I think in the campaign in general, would I make any changes? I think I did get some bad advice for some people in my campaign. I mean, for example, they told me on the campaign, never drink. Never drink. But I'm not a campaign. I'm a candidate. The other thing is not so much a change, but what was surprising was Evan and I engaged in debates in forums, and so did Martha Copley, and so did Steve Grossman, and so did other Democrats that didn't make it through their primaries. Remember Juliet Kayyem and Joe Alamo, Don Berwick also did, and also Jeff McCormick and Scott Lively. And yet the fellow who won the race didn't do those things. So that was sort of a surprise, probably to me and maybe to them as well. I don't think I'd make any changes on the issues, and I have no regrets.
Evan?
That's awesome to be able to say, and I agree. I feel the same way on the no regrets side. I think that's a good philosophy for life. I have to compliment Mark because there were so many of those forums. There were a couple dozen of them put on by different groups that had an interest in various different topics. A lot of them came in with a predisposition to say that they didn't want to take Mark very seriously because they heard the word Tea Party and they said, here was a guy that was going to, I don't know what they were going to do. I remember one that was about early childhood education where the moderator, Allison King from NECN, made a very snarky comment to you about because you were a Republican, you couldn't possibly care about early childhood education. Wow. And I sat there, I was like, wow, that's wild. And Mark very tactfully and appropriately talked about your own personal beliefs and how much you did care about that issue, in fact, some of your personal experiences. And I respect that a lot because what Mark was doing was coming to audiences that were treating him with almost hostility, but it was kind of a haughty hostility that I think we've become too accustomed to in our politics. It's that we know better and you, Rube from Central Mass, can't possibly be here with us. So I give him credit for that, and I think that's a really, that's something we should I applaud. And for me, that was very, one of the reasons when I was asked, please come, I was like, to be with Mark, I'll do that, for sure, and to be with all three. If I were going to change something, I'd say make sure that debates are open to all the candidates. We're here in Worcester, where this was where I was disinvited from a debate, where they'd invited me and then said, no, you can't come anymore. And that to me is, look, I expected they would try to keep someone like me out of those debates because I'm just going to talk about issues and not use vague platitudes to hide from it. And that is challenging to the status quo. That is challenging to the establishment. The questions that you guys are putting together for tonight are ones that I think in the course of the gubernatorial campaign should have been asked of the candidates, but they were not. And so when we have a democracy in which our political leaders avoid engagement on hard topics and don't want to give direct answers to difficult questions, we all suffer for it. But it's because we let it happen. It's because we let it happen. So we have to organize like you're doing. We may all disagree on a lot of different issues, but I think we all agree on the fact that organized and mobilized people are what it takes to bring about meaningful change.
Yes. Very good. Well, I'm going to put a 1A, I'm going to add a 1B to this. Obviously, if what's involved in my next question pertaining to number 1, ultimately both of you would have liked to have won. Unfortunately, you didn't. So, what do you feel that you accomplished by running? Mark?
I think that any candidate who runs wants to give a voice to those people who support. In the primary, I earned a certain number of votes. In the general, Evan earned a certain number of votes. those people felt passionate enough to vote for us rather than those other candidates. And without us being in the race, they would have voted for somebody else that didn't support their views in the entirety that they would have wanted. So they had a chance to vote for somebody they wanted to support.
Well, yeah, I didn't win the election, but we won something pretty important, which was the creation of a new independent party in Massachusetts, the United Independent Party. That's a historic accomplishment, and to get that number of people to come out and bravely vote in a close election, where people felt as if, look, my vote was going to swing something one way or the other, they still came out in large numbers, 72,000 plus people to support what we did. In fact, in Western Massachusetts and Central Mass, but especially in Western Mass, where we spent a lot of time, we had towns with 10, 12, 14% of the voters came out to vote for my campaign and for the United Independent Party. So that's a big deal. When you think about the fact that so much change does not happen in our politics, to see actually something new and unpredictable happening in it, that's kind of cool. That's the kind of disruption we need in order to bring about this kind of change and betterment of our system.
Let's roll back the time a little bit. Let's pretend this is a year ago. Now let's pretend that neither of you were known by anybody here. Now, one common denominator: you're both successful business people, and you both have passion to make a difference. Mark, tell a few things about yourself in case there's somebody in the room who doesn't know much about you.
The reason that I ran is much like you guys. If you guys don't know my story, grew up in Western Mass. My mom went only to the 7th grade, and my dad worked at the post office. And college was not in our family makeup. And so when I graduated from high school, I did not go to college. Went to work at a college envelope company, enjoyed the union there, what was my street, earned the value of the clock. And eventually, I did go to college, ended up at WPI here where I earned 3 degrees in engineering. But I really honestly believe that we have overemphasized the role of college education in this country, that we feel like that's the only way that people can actually. And so I'm a big advocate of vocational training. I think we need a lot more plumbers and electricians and mechanics and welders. Painters.
Oh, by the way, Matt sells paint, just in case he hasn't told you today within the last half hour. I just thought Matt sells paint. Okay.
So I think that having that background and learning life's lessons just in ordinary life, that's what I think people want to hear in their politicians. And I think far too often they belong to the parties, and the parties have a standard line, and they can't identify with the common men and women who are just trying to eke out a life and a better life for themselves and their children. And I think I bring a broad perspective, and just have to do it.
Thank you. Evan?
You know, I grew up outside of Boston in Newton, Mass, and yeah, right. Somebody.
One clap.
That's okay. That's a clap. We'll take it. It's 3% of the claps. I spent the last 13 years prior to doing this as the president of a healthcare business that helps people make sure they get the right diagnosis when they're facing an illness. The company's called Best Doctors. And during my time there, we grew it from 9 employees to over 600 employees, global business. And so, you know, that's the kind of entrepreneurial success story that you hear about. There's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that goes into that process. It's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen for a lot of people. But I am very keenly aware of where I came from, because my grandfather grew up in Russia. And when he was 14 years old, most of his family was murdered because they were Jewish. And he escaped as a 14-year-old and managed to get all the way across Europe somehow. This is a man who lived to be 101, so I hear these stories and I still don't believe how he did this. He ended up in Cuba and was there by himself on a beach. did some odd jobs, learned how to eat mangoes. I mean, no Russian kids knew about mangoes. Saved some money, moved to Venezuela because people said that's where the opportunity is. Started a business with his brother who came over later, and that's where he spent the rest of his life. He sent my father here when my father was 14 to live with an aunt in New York, and he became a doctor, and he became a professor at Harvard Medical School. So that is within a lifetime of me, and so many of us in this country, this is the typical story we have. The reason that people always felt like this was the place to come is because you could get a fair shot here in America. And the problem we have today is that that's going away. And what used to be fair shot for everybody has been replaced by a fair shot for those that are connected.
Yeah.
And that's what people ran away from in these other countries.
Yes.
So I felt as if, as a voter that's sitting on the sidelines and watching that and feeling bad about it was not satisfactory. And so like you, I decided to just get up and do something. And that's where I decided, with a group of supporters, to found the United Independent Party, to run for governor, to leave all that stuff I was doing before behind in order to dedicate myself to this cause. So that's, that's me, that's who I am, that's what I put on the table, that's not going to change.
By the way, what they just demonstrated, because only the first question they knew about, that they can both walk and talk and chew bubble gum at the same time. And they can think for themselves. They don't need, that's something that when you guys mentioned having everybody at the debate table, which I think has to be done if you're on the ballot, if you've got, if you've done everything that you should be there. It isn't fair when media or some group says, no, you can't show up because you can't win or we don't like you. That's not right. Because everybody deserves a shot to have their voice heard. And I think that both of you have done a great job at that. Now we have a governor who just after spending, let's see, in the last couple years, 27, I don't know, somewhere around $35 million on his office for the last couple months he's going to be there. And wants a raise. And, by the way, he's cutting taxes, and the money's coming back to local cities and towns. I don't know if you know that or not, but that's what he wants to do because he wants a raise. Local cities and towns are raising local taxes and fees to help offset deficits and because of lower state aid. And the money that has been earmarked to go back to them is not coming back to them. Charlie Baker has pledged no new taxes, but how realistic is that? How will he be able to lower taxes? Talk about your plans to restore local aid if you get back into politics, which I kind of think both of you will. At least we hope you will. And how can you ease the tax burden in Massachusetts? Mark?
I like what President Kennedy said back in the 60s. He was a Democrat, but he was a conservative, and he said if you want to raise revenues, you don't raise taxes, you cut them. And you cut taxes, you put more money into people's pockets. They go out, they make investments. The businesses have to create more things because more people are buying them. They hire more people are on the payroll. More payroll taxes flow into the coffers of state and local governments. So I don't see any problem in lowering taxes in order to take up the budget deficit. And of course, in the campaign, I talked about the $2 billion each and every year that are taken from our pocketbooks and wallets and given to illegal immigrants. If you listen to the mayors of our cities and towns, this is not a compassion problem, this is a capacity problem. They are being overburdened. They cannot provide the services for people who need them. I'm talking about our poor and our homeless and our veterans because they have to give them to people who came here and they trespassed to get here. And again, we're a compassionate people. And compassion and charity begins at home. And we deal first with those who are in our own communities. And if we can afford to take care of the rest of the world, we're a pretty generous nation as well. And that $2 billion each and every year, if you divide it by the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, it amounts to a lot of local aid, way and above what people are talking about now. That would be my solution.
Kevin?
Well, we've got some serious issues to deal with, and I know in our country over the last 30 years, we've had a constant debate over high taxes, low taxes. This is pretty much, you could summarize the history of American politics for the last 30 years saying it's a debate between high taxes and low taxes. And the thing is, in Massachusetts, and I know this is not what most people believe, but the government has been cutting taxes pretty consistently over the last decade and a half, a little bit longer than that actually. So the state income tax is about to go down to 5.15% because the tax revenues have been hitting the targets in order to do that, and they will continue to drop if tax revenues keep going up, down to 5%. So the problem's not that we aren't finding ways to cut taxes, we are. I can say as a business person, I think it'd be better to have a lower corporate tax. But again, let's be very real about what's happening. We have to pay for the government we say we want. So the money's got to come from somewhere. And over the last decade and a half, as we've been cutting taxes, aid is being cut to cities and towns. So the cities and towns turn around and raise their taxes to the extent that they can because of Prop 2.5. So everybody complains about higher property taxes. We're just shifting the tax burden to a different tax collector. Because the cities and towns can't collect enough taxes because of the Prop 2.5, they have to cut local services. So we've got this downward spiral. And then in the political process, what we end up having is one side saying, let's keep cutting taxes, and one side saying, let's raise taxes, and that leaves the majority of voters saying, I don't want to listen to either side of this debate, and I'm not even going to vote. So we have to be real about this. So let's look at where the money's really going, and I'm going to start with what it means for a family. Because families in Massachusetts today spend pretty much the majority of the money that they earn on either their health insurance premium or on their housing costs. And these are two fundamental issues that the state of Massachusetts has not dealt with. And we'll probably get into it later. I don't want to take up the time on that right now, but I'll tell you that dealing with those two issues would do more to alleviate this problem in our budget than any of the stuff we're hearing about. The last thing I'll say is this. The fact that there was going to be a problem with our budget was something that should have been apparent to everybody. It shouldn't have been a surprise that comes out 2 days after the election. All right, there was an article written in the Boston Globe right after, I think it was the Monday or Tuesday after the election, that said, here's 4 or 5 pieces of news that came out after the election that we wonder how they might have affected the election if they had been disclosed beforehand. And I read the article and I said, you guys are the Boston Globe. You're supposed to go out and find this stuff, not wait for someone to tell you. And one of those things was this budget hole. It would have been really nice to know what Charlie Baker, what Martha Coakley, what I thought about this topic before the election, but unfortunately, we do not. It would have been interesting to know, for example, what Charlie Baker thought about having the Olympics come to Boston before we submitted a bid to do so. But that's happened already. So once again, let's not be fooled by the old debates that are trapping us in this country, and start to be real about what's actually happening and how we have to take action to address it.
Does our present tax structure present obstacles for new businesses and job growth? Mark?
That's a no-brainer. Absolutely. On a national level, and a state level, and on a local level. Boy, there are companies in the United States that have their headquarters overseas because they want to avoid the high corporate tax on a national level. If we drop that corporate tax to some other level and made it competitive with the rest of the world, those businesses would come back here and we would enjoy the tax revenues from those businesses. The same thing happens on a state level. The same thing happens on a local level. We have to make Massachusetts and the rest of our country business friendly. And the corporate tax rate is one of the ways to do that. This, in the prior question, reminded me of something. And Donald Berwick was another fellow that was a candidate for coming here in our discussion. And in the forums and the debates, he talked about having in his office down in Washington a quote from Hubert Humphrey on his wall. And I have it here. I want to read it to you. Because liberals and conservatives, you might not think so, but we agree, I think, on what we want. But I think we disagree on how we go about getting it. And I think this leads right into it. So this is a quote from Hubert Humphrey. It was once said that the moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped, unquote. That is very, I see a lot of people shaking their heads. That's very hard to argue with. I'm going to argue with it. I mean, if we care about the children, And if we care about the elderly, if we care about the sick and the needy and the handicapped, why in the hell would we want the government to take care of them?
That's right.
I mean, this is our government. We can't run the post office, the social security system, the welfare system, the Veterans Administration, and we want them to take care of these important things. In the spirit of the season, remember the story about Scrooge. Before he's visited by the ghost, he's visited by two people who ask him for a charitable donation. And they ask him, how much can we put you down for? Right? And he says, nothing. And so they say, oh, so you want to be anonymous? He says, no, I want to be left alone. This is not my business. Don't we have enough prisons? I pay my taxes. Scrooge thinks it's the business of government to take care of the poor. We're not supposed to be Scrooges, right? But his other partner in the business, right, long dead Marley, was a liberal Democrat, Scrooge was, with regard to the government taking care of our problems and our needs. But the ghost of Marley is a Republican.
Yeah, that's your job. That's right.
Most people are frightened of Republicans now as they're frightened of ghosts. But what does Marley say, right? Scrooge says to the ghost of Marley, as they're discussing, Marley, you always were a good man of business, right? And what does Marley say? He says, business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, forbearance, it goes on and on and on, were all my business. And then he's being punished now because he didn't take care of his business. So you have to remember, what is the business of government? Now, the Declaration of Independence is a great document. It gives all these reasons why we're going to war, why we're breaking the bonds between us and England. It gives one reason why governments are instituted among men. And that's to secure our God-given rights. You know, if government would do that, we'd be better off taking care of the homeless and the needy ourselves. You know, at best, every dollar that the government takes from us to spend on the needy, at best, a quarter, 25 cents goes to the needy. The rest goes to the politicians and the bureaucrats and the bureaucracies with their high pensions. If the government gives that dollar back, and we just took 70 cents of it and pumped it into the economy, and the other 30 cents gave it to charities, we spent 10%, 3 cents on administration, the poor would get more. You know, we spent $20 trillion since LBJ and the Great Society, and the poverty rate has not gone down.
That's right.
But what's the business of government? I think the government's intruded on our business. We should be taking care of those things because they're more important and we can do a better job at them.
Evan?
So, you know, on the question of taxes as barrier to business growth, as a business person, let me tell you something, that here in Massachusetts, my company, we hired hundreds of people over the course of a decade plus. And the tax rate in Massachusetts was not a consideration in that decision-making process. I'll tell you what was. It was the fact that this was easily the most expensive place for us to do business in the country. Easily. And there were two reasons, the same two reasons I talked about before. Healthcare costs were really high. Housing costs were really high. This matters. Healthcare costs, by the way, are so high because of something I talked about a lot in the campaign, the monopolistic consolidation of hospitals into these big systems. This in many ways is the story of what's happened in America over the last 30 or 40 years. Big enterprises start basically writing the regulations that govern what they do.
Yeah.
And in healthcare, hospitals merging with each other has caused them to raise their prices. They act like monopolists. Everybody knows that monopolies are bad, but our government lets it happen. In Massachusetts, this has been a bipartisan effort because Partners, which is the entity in Eastern Mass that's buying up all the hospitals, was started in the early 90s when Governor Weld, with his Secretary of HHS, a man named Charlie Baker, decided to deregulate the hospital market, and that's when they started to merge with each other. It's good capitalism. Capitalism can get really distorted. And I think one of the things that we lose sight of in our country is that we have this idea that there's the free market and then there's the not free market. The hospital market, the healthcare market we have today is not a free market by any stretch. Hospitals, cronyism, that's good, that's well said. Because what these hospitals are doing is, with the blessing of government, because the other opponent that I had, Martha Copley, was signing off on the deal for Partners to buy out two of the biggest hospital systems that are left. Both sides do it, and they don't want to talk about it because they're all in on it. There was a fundraiser that was held in the last couple of weeks of the campaign by a man named Jack Connors, who used to be the chairman of Partners. And he's been a lifelong Democrat. He was holding a fundraiser for Charlie Baker. And they raised $100,000. It was at a restaurant in Boston called L'Espalier. It's a fancy French restaurant. Man of the people kind of restaurant. And they raised $100,000. The people at that fundraiser were, among others, executives from big hospitals. Now the Boston Globe, I'm picking on the Boston Globe. Worcester Telegram Gazette is here. That's okay. I sued you guys. I'm sorry. It got resolved, and it just didn't work out. But I appreciate it. But the Globe reported that as, isn't it interesting that a Democrat?
Did you say you're suing them?
No, I did.
This is definitely a meat and potatoes production, isn't it?
No.
Hey, first you don't succeed, try again.
Exactly. There was a great band, a great philosopher's band called the Beastie Boys said you have to fight for your rights at party. So the Globe reported as, isn't it interesting that a Democrat is endorsing Charlie Baker? Now I thought the more interesting story is, what does the former chairman of Partners want from the person he thinks is going to be the next governor? What do all those hospital executives want? I think it's obvious, but it doesn't get talked about. So we are being deceived because, again, the debate that happens is about high taxes, low taxes, big government, small government. And the trouble is, what's happening is the cronyism, the corporatism, the extent to which these big entities are running our government and are taking money out of our pockets. What creates jobs is people having money in their pockets. And what's taking money out of people's pockets is the incredibly high cost of living. So the transfer of wealth that's happening in our country is going from people who are working for a living to people in these big entities, to people that are giving out expensive student loans, to people that are writing subprime mortgages, to people that are running large hospital systems, to people that are running these large financial services institutions and health insurance companies. And our leaders in our politics are unwilling to take on these groups because of the money that they pour into the system. There are more people out there who understand this and will vote to change that than there are people who are giving all that money. So this can change, but only when we organize and we vote to make this kind of change.
I'm seeing some hands all up for questions, so what I'll try to do is kind of break this midpoint, because I don't want you to, if you have a thought or a question you'd like to put in, I don't want you to lose it by the time we get to the end. Gentlemen, let me ask you a question. City of Worcester. People go to work for the city of Worcester, especially the police and fire guys and men and women and the EMTs who want to, they lay their lives on the line every day because they could get shot, they can die in a fire like virtually right down the street. What do you think about $1.1 billion in unfunded liabilities for retirement and health care for the people working in the city? Now, some cities and towns, and I'm going to compliment Shrewsbury for a moment, has a great job. They actually came up with a 5-year plan, and within the next 5 years, they're going to eliminate their unfunded liabilities. This city has thrown maybe $2 or $3 million at it when they got caught by one of the city councilors who got elected and brought this up. What do you guys think about that? Mark?
I think it leads into something Evan had said about the people who get elected. What are they expecting? Again, trying to tie it into the sort of the spirit of the Christmas season here. I remember trying to buy gifts for my kids when I was out of work, and some of the things that I wanted to buy, I couldn't buy because I couldn't afford them. I couldn't give them these things. I could afford to give them these things. So, with regard to pensions, maybe there's a union that pledges to vote a certain way, and the candidate who wins looks kindly on that particular union. we can't always give the best that we would like to give. Even in the case of pensions, we can give the best that we can afford. And so you've got to look at the bottom up. You've got to look at what revenues you have. And yes, maybe your constituency that got you elected would like this, but based on revenues coming in, you can only afford that. And those are hard decisions. It's easy for a business to do that because you have competition, you have to stay in business. But for a politician who's running a government, whether it be local or state, that's not as easy a decision as it should be, but it's not as easy a decision as it should be because you've got all these groups that want something from him. And so they'll afford to give them something even though they can't pay for it. And this is bad news. And you end up with situations like we just discussed.
Evan?
This problem of pension liabilities is happening not just here in Massachusetts or here in Worcester, but all around the country. And it did work through the private sector. Obviously, when you look at what happened with in the automotive industry, the workers that are working for state and city government, but certainly for state government, don't get Social Security. So they're looking at the pension for their retirement benefits. And a lot of the pension obligations that were given out were coming from a time when the economy was completely different than it is today, when that was the norm of what was going on in the marketplace. So there are people who made a deal, and the state or the city made a deal with them to say, look, when you retire, we're going to provide you such and such. Now, the problem is the economy changed in the meantime, and now what do we do? Because we really have a math problem, a real serious math problem. And most people in politics won't talk about this in the way that it should be talked about. Because I don't know what the answer is of what do you do. Because here are your choices. And there are states where they've done an interesting job. Down in Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo worked very, very hard with unions and with other groups to say, here's the math. There's a liability of this number of dollars. We only have this amount of dollars. And our choices are this. We can either go and do a substantial tax hike in order to pay for your benefits, which is not going to go very well. We can cut your benefits or negotiate some kind of solution to your benefits, or we can do what we've seen some cities and towns do across the country, and that is to file bankruptcy, in which case you're not going to get any benefits. And this is just reality. Now, we're all grown-ups, or at least we're all about 21. So everybody who's dealing with this issue of pensions is an adult, and we should have a very adult conversation about how we handle this difficult problem. So if I were the governor and I were dealing with this issue at the state level, I would want to be sitting with the folks that are eligible for these pensions to say, what do we do and how do we solve this? Because we have to work it out together. It should not be the kind of thing where we say my way or the highway, because that's not a great way to solve anything. That's what America has turned into, unfortunately. Let's treat people like adults. Let's manage our way through this in the best way we can. Let's realize that some of these promises were made that just simply cannot be kept. Let's deal with that hard reality and figure out what to do about it. But that's hard. That doesn't create applause. That doesn't get you on the stage with people saying, isn't that so wonderful? He waved a magic wand and fixed it. It's so much easier to kick the can down the road, isn't it? But that's what we do in our country. Well, that didn't used to be how we did things in America. This was a country where you used to be able to send a guy to the moon. Remember that? I don't. I was born in 1969. But the thing is, that used to be the kind of stuff that we could say, hey, we can do that. Now in the United States, if you want to build a rail line down to the South Coast, and you can have differing views on whether we should or shouldn't, but once we agreed on it, we can't even build 25 miles worth of track in Massachusetts. We used to be able to build a railroad across the country. Now, it's too hard. It's too hard. We can't do things. Well, I think we're better than that. I think we're braver than that. I think we're smarter than that.
If I can make a comment here, I think that this is the reason that we need business people to be elected to office, adverse to career politicians. Right? By the way, just as a side note, Evan, that whole train down to the South Coast, I don't know if you know this or not, but they won't tell you how much it's going to cost to build it. It's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I did find out from 2 different transportation companies with the state's own numbers that they project the ridership could be. They could supply limousines cheaper per year to transport people from their houses to where they work in Boston and back than to operate the rail. But who's that now? Okay.
Because this is a great topic.
Yes.
So let's just think about this for 1 second, because that's fair, and that sounds cool to be able to take state-funded limousine.
Kind of neat, huh?
So I haven't thought of that, and I support that.
I'm just thinking you use the 15-passenger,
You can do
van.
that.
I mean, you can even cheaper.
No, I don't support that. But here's the thing. We try to run these rail services as if they're businesses, and they're not. They're just not. They're a public service. And there's a lot of economic benefit that comes from having transit available, not just for people from New Bedford to come up to Boston. All right? There's an economic benefit, sure, that has the train running from Worcester into Boston. That helps on both ends of the thing. But all along the rail line, there's development that happens. And one of the issues we have in Massachusetts that's really fundamental is our lack of housing production. There's plenty of high-end homes that get built. All right? There's not a lot that happens for middle-income people. And it's because cities and towns don't get the money that they need from the state to support their schools. And so cities and towns do things. There's a term of art called child-proof zoning that you may have heard about. This to me is the most anti-American thing I can think of. We're trying to keep families out of communities. Right, by the way, this happens to affect communities of color more than it does the white community. So that if you're coming from Boston and the community's gentrifying, you need somewhere to move, you find not many places to live. But we are failing in our obligation as a state when we don't make it possible for people to come up and to work hard and see the American dream. Building things like this rail project, you can have a very important impact on the economy of all those communities up and down from New Bedford back up into Boston, much like the way the rail line works in each of these different directions. So I believe in those things because I think they're pro-growth, and I think that's what the agenda should be about. Never about, we can't because the future looks worse than the present, but rather, what are we capable of that we can be brave enough to do the things that we can do.
Mark, do you have any?
On the South Coast Rail, I was against it. And the reason I was against it is I've made that trip down 495 and up 24 to Avon, and Route 24 is what people use now instead of the South Coast Rail. It's a horrible thing. You have people commuting from the South Coast up into Boston because of jobs. So now we don't want them to make that terrible commute up 24 in a car. We're going to build a rail so people get in on a train and commute from their hometown near New Bedford, up to Boston for jobs. I say, bring jobs to New Bedford and forget about driving and taking a train up to Boston.
Thank you.
And it all goes back to making Massachusetts business friendly. It's a tough state. I mean, think about what happened in the last couple of years. We had a tech tax that was passed by Beacon Hill. Why did they have it overturned? I mean, it was going to supposedly generate revenue. I suppose they did it because of the pressure, but when you look at it, it was going to drive businesses out of Massachusetts. Raising taxes, this is what I'm saying, this is what President Kennedy has said, this is what conservatives say. Raising taxes doesn't raise revenues, it just causes people and businesses to go to other less taxed regions. This is very common sense, and it's played out. So now what's happened recently, we've raised the minimum wage. We're increasing the amount of sick time and pay that businesses have to contribute. Government's gotten involved in this thing. When businesses want to come here, they look at those things. It may not be the overriding factor, but they look at those things. We're not making Massachusetts business friendly in that regard. So now we're talking about a new government project that's going to lose money. You're going to pay your taxes to fund this thing. And people are going to sit on the train instead of in their cars and go into Boston and spend how many hours a day away from their families and stuff. I just don't think it's the right solution.
I'm just going to check.
One other thing on
Sure.
just on this tech tax point, if you remember, this was one of the things that was passed as part of that transportation law. And the problem with it was not that it was making Massachusetts not business friendly. It was the fact that people had already sold the services that were now going to be retroactively taxed. And they had not, the legislature, gone and engaged the people in the community that was being affected by this to find out if it was going to work out to tax them. In general, as a business, if they tax you, you just pass that along to consumers. So it isn't even the business that really gets taxed. It's all the rest of us who buy the product. So the bigger issue these guys had was that they could not go and pass that along to consumers. They couldn't do it. So that was the very controversial part of that for people in the technology community. At the end of the day, once again, we've got to pay for the government we say we want. And every time we keep using the same old sound bites against taxation and government and big and small, we're getting deceived. We're missing out on what's really going on. The monopolistic consolidation of hospitals, the lack of any housing policy, the failure to support our cities and towns so that they can make sure that homes are built so that people have more money in their pockets. These are the real issues. They don't want to deal with it. They don't even want to talk about it. That's what we have to keep our eye on.
We're going to reverse the order just for this question, because Evan actually, even though it's on the sheet, you just led into it perfectly. During your debate at Middlesex College with McCormick, the cost of living came up in this state, and the lack of housing starts came up. And it was stated as being, you stated then as being the two main reasons that we're so high in cost of doing business here. Both of you and McCormick came up with plans to help the economy. However, shouldn't the plan be for government to just stay out of the way and let market forces drive the economy, not government plans? Evan?
Well, here's the thing, because it isn't that government is out of the way right now. Government is smack dab in the middle of it. And
Like this.
About like that, yeah. The problem is this has been built. Government's preventing building from happening, unless it's high-end housing. And this is something that's very important to understand. We live in a state that is a home rule form of government. It's been this way since colonial times. We have 351 cities and towns. They're in charge of what happens inside of their borders, as it should be. The cities and towns rely on state aid in order to pay for the needed local services, like schools, like police and fire. The state pays for a huge chunk of that. Now, over the last decade and a half, that level of state aid has been basically going down. As I've talked about before, is making the cities and towns cash strapped. Try to plan what they're worried about when they try to plan for their own futures is making sure that people don't move into their communities unless they're going to buy a really big expensive house that has a lot of property tax in it. Okay? What they're most worried about is that people will move into their communities that want to live in a starter home and are going to have 2 or 3 kids that are going to go to the public schools, because it costs $13,000, $14,000 a year to have a kid go to the schools. And if you're going to bring 3 of those, and if your property taxes are less than that amount, we're in trouble in that city or town. So that's where this idea of child-proof zoning happens. Now, when we talk about economic growth, all the really good economic research shows that if you want to have lots of jobs, you need to have lots of homes being built. This is study after study after study. And when I say lots of homes, think about how things were, I don't remember right after World War II, when returning GIs had lots of these starter homes being built. They had places they could go. They were inexpensive. They could afford to live there. They could take out a mortgage, but it was manageable. And they could then sell that and move up into something bigger later. We stopped building that kind of housing in Massachusetts many years ago. And there's been studies going back more than a decade that show that we need to be building at least 10,000 units per year of that kind of housing in addition to what already is being built for the last decade. And it hasn't happened at all. We keep falling further and further behind every single year. So how does this story end? Because where we are now, young people, when they graduate from our schools here, they leave the state in large numbers. Older people that might want to downsize out of a larger home they raise their families in do not find places in which they can live. So we are eating our seed corn in Massachusetts. We get away with it because of so many of the great things we have going on in our Commonwealth. But it is not a good policy for growth, which is what our policies need to be based on. So this requires some money, okay? Let's be honest about this. Let's say the cities and towns need, I'm going to use a number that others have used, about $1 billion of additional state aid. $1 billion, oh my gosh, that's a lot of money, and it really is. Where's that going to come from? Well, I can take a look at the state budget and say, geez, they give out about $780 million a year in tax breaks to really big, profitable companies. That seems like a good place to find money for cities and towns. Seems to me. I think those companies would do okay if they wanted to go to the public market and sell some more shares instead of coming to the taxpayers and say, give me some more money. We need to rethink our priorities and get them focused on growth, on helping families have more money so they can get ahead, and helping small businesses, not these really big ones.
Mark?
I guess in general, your question was, should the government just get out of the way and let free market forces work? And I would say yes. However, I do think there needs to be a plan on the part of government to back out and let those things happen. I mean, I remember when Reagan was talking about, a lot of people just want to have government get out of the way and get off their back so they can make a living and make decisions for themselves. On the campaign trail, I had a staunch Republican, I couldn't believe it, came up to me and he said, if you get elected, what are you going to do for me? And before the fellow next to me could respond and said, hey, don't you remember Kennedy asked not what your country can do for you? I said, I'm going to try to make government as small as I can and give you back as much money of yours that we've taken from you so you can decide what's best for you. It's funny, I don't look to the government to solve many problems. I don't trust that the bureaucracies that are set up are efficient to do them. And why is that? Because they don't have competition. They can do a very bad job in staying office. They can do a very bad job in run bankruptcy, cities into bankruptcy. And it doesn't matter. You know, people can vote with their feet, but it's kind of hard to get up and move. The one area where the government, I think, does a fantastic job is in the military. And I think that the reason why it does a great job in the military is because our soldiers have competition. And the competition is the enemy, and they're staring back at them on the end of another rifle barrel. And you better damn well do your job well, or your life is at stake. That's why the military does such a great job. So I say yes, let free market forces work. I think that's the best solution to our problems, but the government has to have some sort of a plan to downsize. And good luck having that happen in Massachusetts on Beacon Hill, because they want to create their bureaucracies and their power. If government downsizes, so do their kingdoms and fiefdoms.
I mean, the thing about government is that it plays a lot of really important roles. I mean, the military is one, police, fire, public safety, EMTs, schools, food safety. You know, there's so many things. Air traffic control. I mean, you can go down the list of all the things the government does that are really important that we just take from and figure, oh, well, that's just there. We figure, oh, well, that's just there. That's part of the natural order of things. But what I look towards is the fact that there are things that we need our government to do that it is not doing. And when I talk about the issue of the hospital consolidation, and I keep talking about this because it is the #1 largest expense that people face is your health insurance costs. And our government's failure to break up those kinds of monopolies or change the economic model so they can't profiteer at everybody's expense. That's a failure of government. And it is not a truth that letting those hospitals continue to do what they do is in everybody's best interests. There are people who will tell you it. There are people from those hospitals that will say, you know what, the bigger we get, the more efficient we become. Now, I've got Verizon, and I don't have the choice of switching to Comcast. I'm not sure that I would. I know that companies, like the cable companies, will tell you, it's better when we're bigger. You don't need choice. Choice? Come on, don't choose. You don't need to, it's so confusing. Comcast and Verizon, the channels don't change. You don't need that. It was, you know, Fox used to be 625 and now it's 803. How are you going to live in that world? So they want to keep you away from choice. But this is how monopolies work. And they work closely, hand in glove with the government, always. This is our history. This is the reality. So government has a really important role to play to make sure that that playing field stays level. Nature does not lead to level playing fields. Bottom line, that's what we've seen in capitalist economies. And I'm a capitalist. I got my suit on. I'm a capitalist. You know Howie Carr? You know the guy. So he called me a communist, or he called me Comrade Falchuk. Do I sound like a communist to you?
No.
Of course not. Oh, it's awesome. You guys are the Tea Party. Thank you. Mark didn't answer. He said we're ready.
All right. After the next question, we're going to open up for questions from the audience for a moment. Before I give you number 5, I just want to mention something. The Unemployment Prevention Agency, the EPA, and the Department of Transportation have been directed by the guy in the White House to do a lot of things that hurt every one of us in this room when it comes to energy costs. And just because of my background, I happen to know a lot about this. So I'm going to preface this question with a little bit of background for you. You know, they're from New York pipeline to go from New York to Drake. We all know that? Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you understand what the problem is that there's no pipeline from New York to Drake? Okay. Let me explain it to you real quickly. The pipe starts out in the western part of the country at a 3-foot inside diameter. When it gets to Selkirk, New York, it's 6 inches. Okay? Now, what do you do if it doesn't go any further than Selkirk, New York? And you need energy here in New England. By the way, that is liquid propane, liquid gas, gaseous gas, meaning they haven't converted, oil, heating oil. Gasoline's a little bit different. You have to get trucks, and you have to drive to Selkirk, New York, and you have to fill it up, and you have to drive it back to New Bedford, Fall River, Providence, Manchester, Boston, and a few other places, and then it goes to distributors and wholesalers, and then it comes to us. You may not know that this president decided through regulating the trucking industry, and he looked at us specific regions, us being one of them, that limited the number of hours that a tractor-trailer driver can drive, and they've cut those back dramatically over the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, it's about half what they legally used to be able to drive. So no longer, if you remember last January how all of a sudden our heating oil and our gas went way up? Okay. Well, that's at the peak, right? Naturally. The problem is, it became a 2-day drive from up here to go to Selkirk, New York, to get that truck, fill it up, and come back, adverse to a 1-day drive. That doubled your transportation costs in labor, in man hours, the total man hours that it takes to move it, okay? It didn't double the fuel to move it, but it almost doubled everything. Congress even woke up and realized that there was a mistake there. So they gave a wintertime exemption for hauling fuels, and they passed that on January 21, almost unanimously. Does anybody know when the guy in the White House signed the bill?
December 31st.
It was at the end of April. Spring's here.
Right, yeah.
Put it put us in office. Put us in office.
So, I understand I understand that there are issues. Several people were talking about this as people came in, about eminent domain and pipelines and things like that. Some people are mentally concerned. Well, I grew up in oil country in Pennsylvania. I grew up in coal country. I know an awful lot about this. First of all, pipelines today are not made out of steel pipes that rot out. And it is interesting, by the way, that the ones that we get water from the quadrant they here are about 150 years old, and they were designed to be 75. That's not to say that there can't be an accident. Of course there can. There can be any kind of accident, okay? But today they use products to run the oil and the gas through that aren't affected by weather, and they're not going to corrode. And they're double sleeved. So it's basically, there's a pipe inside a pipe. So if the pipe carrying the product does break, it goes to the exterior pipe and it's contained. Okay, that being said, gentlemen, this pipeline is proposed from Selkirk, New York to Drake. It is going to create some jobs. Some of it's going to get exported. Most of it's about that. They hear it. They don't talk about that. How do you guys feel about this pipeline? And how do you feel about the people who say, well, not in my land and we can't do it? And in those specific towns, I can't say that word, who voted against it, it hurts everybody in the rest of New England. Now, that kind of gets a little touchy there, but people need to look at it in that context. Mark?
Actually, I'm for it. The part of government is trying to make decisions with regard to the common good, common welfare, and as President Lincoln reminded us, we can't please all people all the time. There are some people that are going to be adversely affected by this. A quick story, in my neighborhood we have a cul-de-sac, and in the middle of the cul-de-sac there's this green area, there's some trees, and my next door neighbor, out of the goodness of his heart, has mowed that lawn and fertilized it and all at his own expense. And a couple of years ago, he put something out on the neighborhood Facebook page that, hey, can you guys chip in $5 for me? Sounds reasonable, right? So there was a vote taken. Should we get a landscape? Should we month to take care of it? And they had a few bucks every month to take care of it. And there was a vote taken, blah, blah, blah. Well, the majority wanted pay him some money each and every month. And a woman who voted against paying him something every month complained. Well, doesn't my vote count? Yes, your vote counted, and you lost. I'm sorry. It's a democracy. The majority rules. Somebody's not going to be happy. Somebody's not going to be happy. So I'm for it, and I do understand that it's going to impact. My uncle has on his property the existing pipeline that took from Tennessee goes to his property. It's been there for years, but yeah, I wouldn't like it in my backyard. I don't think anybody here would like it in their backyard. It's part of the sacrifice that individuals have to make for the common good.
Evan?
Well, I've been against it, but I'll tell you why. Mark told me why too, so I'm not implying that he did. The company that's behind this pipeline, Kinder Morgan, is working with the federal regulatory agency that's going to be doing the eminent domain. Perfect. And these guys have the power to take the land. And the way that many of the people who live along that pipeline was by out about the pipeline was by having someone survey their property. Sometimes it was just by getting one of those door hangers that said, hey, there might be someone on your property, sign this release so that in case anybody gets injured, we're responsible for the injury. And of course, that led the property owner to say, surveying my property for what? And that led to finding out about the pipeline. Now, in the cities and towns, the story I heard over and over again was a landowner going to their town, their selectmen or aldermen, whatever they might have in that community, and saying, what's going on? And the selectman saying, I have the slightest idea what's going on. And they start bringing it up with pipeline. Well, I mean, no pun intended. But I really didn't mean that. That was just what ended up happening is you find out that there were people in the federal government knew all about the desire to build this pipeline, but no one in the local communities did. And there was never this conversation to say, what is in the best interest of the people of Massachusetts? It was never a topic of discussion. There was not a vote. There was not an open hearing process. They tried to do it after the fact of the cities and towns. But it was a complete running roughshod over the concept of self-government, over the concept of home rule, over the concept of local control, are all at the behest of a large politically connected company. Now let me tell you one other thing about this. There was a study that was done, you can read this, that looked at the need for this pipeline, the need for it. And the basis on which they were analyzing this was the need for more natural gas capacity here in Massachusetts. And they set out 3 scenarios: high demand, low demand, or high, middle, and low. And the low scenario was one in which we implemented conservation efforts, where there was more efficiency, where there was more use of solar and wind, which were things that were going on. They decided to use the high demand scenario for their model. And that was the one in which the only sensible choice was to build this additional pipeline. Again, without any public hearing, without any public debate on this issue, the company decided, and the regulators decided this was the direction we needed to go. So I'm against it, both because I don't believe that there's the need, just based on reading the report that the company itself put out, and because I don't like the fact that our government is not accountable to us, and that behind our backs is deciding to do this again at the behest of a large politically connected company. If you hear me telling the same kind of story over and over again, it's because that's what's happening in our country. We're being deceived when people try to distract us by having other debates while this kind of nonsense goes on.
You know, unfortunately, one of the solutions would have been to allow large ships to come into Boston with gas and oil.
Yeah.
Of course, not in my backyard. And you may not know this, but when the Big Dig was orchestrated, the tunnel was built 40 feet higher than it was originally planned. Now, there's 2 issues with that. One, they weren't down in solid earth, they were in muck. Of course, remember that whole story about how they had to freeze the ground? I know a very high-tech engineer who worked on that project. He quit as soon as they did that. He said, because I'm not sticking around with the lawsuits, because when you stop freezing the ground, it's going to leak. And it does. But the big factor here is, by having the tunnel 40 feet higher than it could have been, it stops these ships from coming into Boston because it's not safe for them to pass over the tunnel. Isn't that interesting? You probably haven't heard that one before. Okay, we're going to take some, first thing Lee asked, should we all take, do you want to take a break?
Sure.
Okay, well let's do this. Let's have the commercial. commercials, and then we'll take like a 10-minute break with you guys. Is that all right? Enough commercials. That's me being a radio. Sorry. Yes, Pat sells me. Here's that commercial. This gentleman over here has had his hand up several times. You want to ask a couple questions, sir?
Yeah, I was just.
Yes, I have a question. Talk about paying for the government and why, right? Are you aware that Yorktown Newton educates 600 kids who don't live and it costs $8.5 million a year? I want to know what your opinion is on that.
No, we'll do the questions and then we'll back to the questions. We'll take the break. We'll go ahead. Go take.
Oh, I mean, I'm not specifically aware of those numbers. You're talking about Medco students?
Medco, staff kids, Medco, some others. I mean, there's 600 kids in this school who don't live in Newton but attend Newton schools. That's a whole school, the entire school. Newton had to pay an $11.5 million override, Proposition 2.5 override last year. Yet we're giving away $8.5 million worth of educational services to other cities and towns. And your wife endorsed the override, as far as last I checked.
I didn't know that about her. She's great. I voted for her too.
It's a modern marriage.
Don't you think Boston and other communities that send Newton kids into the Newton school system, they should be paying us the difference between our average cost in state aid for educating their kids in their schools?
No, it's a fair question. So let me say two things about this. One of them is that the way in which the state pays cities and towns, there's a law called Chapter 70, which is woefully out of date. Woefully out of date. It does not reflect the realities of educating kids in now, the second decade of the 21st century. It was a formula created in the early 90s. It was a good idea. It was meant to reduce the disparities in funding, because cities like Newton, we've got resources that other communities do not. So we should take less from the state than the communities that need more. That's appropriate. But they haven't updated the formula, which again is the same story again about cities and towns not getting the aid that they need. That needs to be updated so that cities and towns are getting that money. To the second point, though, which has to do with educating kids from other communities, I support the MECO program. I think it's important. The people of Newton, we had a very transparent, open discussion about these issues. My kids, I got 3 of them in the Newton Public Schools, and we had a vote on the override, and the override passed, and it was a hard-fought battle. Well, what I found most interesting about it was that at the elementary school where my youngest goes, and I give them credit, there were people from the school committee and a couple people from the Board of Aldermen came to talk about this to a packed room of parents. Every one of them, I think, was voting for the override because we were all parents of kids in that elementary school. We needed a modular classroom built, 2 of them actually, for that school. And they were very skeptical. And the things they were asking the people at the Board of Aldermen was, how do we know you need the money that you say you need? How do we know you're not coming back next year for another override, right? How do we know this money's not going to get diverted for other causes? And I found that to be a very fascinating thing. From an audience that was friendly to the overall cause, they didn't trust that the money was going to get spent in the right way. Now, I think it's good that there were that many people there. I think that's great civic engagement. I think we need to see more of that. But once again, once you have the vote, we move forward. We move forward.
But I'm saying for like in the future, don't you think Boston and other communities should be sending Newton an $8.5 million check for educating their kids in the Newton public school system?
I just don't know how that works exactly. Otherwise, I would tell you what I thought. I just don't know how that works. So.
Newton spent about $17,000 per kid to educate the school system. And then they get a couple $1 million of grants from the state for the Medco grant. Right, and that's $8.5 million net cost. Who should be paying that? Should Boston and other communities be paying that, or should the Newton taxpayers be paying that?
Yeah, again, I don't know how the specifics of that work.
Well, basically, I think something that we can just wrap that question up for a moment. I'm going to go back to what Mark said about New Bedford. I think one of the major problems that we run into in education here is the cost and how it's hurt the family unit of taking kids out of their neighborhood. Why don't we concentrate on neighborhoods and make the schools better in the neighborhoods where the parents can watch their kids and they know what's going on? But unfortunately, that isn't the way it happened, and it happened all across the country. Mark, do you have any comments? You're all set? Okay. Alex, you had a quick question, and then we'll talk.
Let's take a break.
Okay, let's take a break, just about 5 to 10 minutes, so please come right back.
Good.